December 23rd, 1944. 7:14 in the morning. The fog hung low over the Ardennes forest, thick and white, muffling sound and swallowing light. Through the mist came the rumble of engines, Panther tanks, half-tracks, trucks loaded with infantry, rolling west along narrow Belgian roads lined with skeletal trees. The column stretched for miles, a mechanical serpent winding through frozen valleys and snow-covered ridges. At the head of the advance, young soldiers from the 2nd Panzer Division sat atop their vehicles, wrapped in greatcoats and scarves, their breath steaming in the December cold. They had been advancing for a week. They had pushed the Americans back. They had taken towns, captured supplies, spread chaos through the Allied lines. And now, as the fog began to lift and pale winter sunlight filtered through the clouds, they believed they were unstoppable. Then the first shell arrived. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. It did not scream down from the sky and bury itself in the road, throwing up frozen earth and gravel. It did not slam into a tank turret or ricochet off stone walls. Instead, it detonated 20 feet above the column, exactly over the center of the road, exactly where the concentration of men and machines was thickest. The blast was catastrophic. Shrapnel sprayed downward in a perfect cone of death, shredding canvas truck covers, puncturing fuel tanks, tearing through flesh and bone. The explosion was followed by another, and another, and another. Each one burst overhead, each one perfectly timed to maximize carnage. The German soldiers had never seen anything like it. They scrambled for cover, diving into ditches and behind vehicles, but there was no cover from above. The shells kept coming, erupting in the air with mechanical precision, turning the road into a killing field. Officers shouted orders, trying to organize a response, but what could they do? You could not shoot back at artillery. You could not hide from something that exploded overhead. You could only endure, or retreat, or die. Within minutes, the column was paralyzed. Burning vehicles blocked the road. Wounded men screamed for medics. Survivors huddled in the tree line, staring at the sky with expressions of confusion and terror. They had faced artillery before. Every soldier on the Western Front had. But this was different. This was surgical. This was lethal in a way that defied their understanding of how war was supposed to work. One German NCO, pulled from the wreckage of a half-track, reportedly asked his captors a single question. "How do your shells know when to explode?" The Americans did not answer. They did not need to. The weapon spoke for itself. In the winter of 1944, the German High Command had gambled everything on one final desperate offensive. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was conceived as a lightning strike through the Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting the Allied lines, capturing the port of Antwerp, and forcing the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace. It was an audacious plan, perhaps even a brilliant one, but it relied on speed, surprise, and the assumption that the Allies were unprepared for a major winter offensive. For the first few days, the plan worked. On December 16, 1944, 3 German armies, over 200,000 men supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, crashed into a thinly defended section of the American front. The initial assault achieved complete surprise. Entire American units were overrun or forced to retreat. Communications broke down. Supply lines were severed. In the confusion, German paratroopers dropped behind Allied lines, and English-speaking commandos in American uniforms sowed chaos and misinformation. Within 48 hours, the Germans had advanced nearly 20 miles, creating a bulge in the Allied line that would give the battle its name. But the German commanders had made the same mistake they had made throughout the war. They had underestimated American adaptability. They had assumed that the U.S. Army was a blunt instrument, dependent on overwhelming firepower and material superiority, incapable of rapid innovation or tactical flexibility. They believed that if you disrupted American logistics, if you broke through their lines and forced them to fight in chaos, they would collapse. They were catastrophically wrong. Among the thousands of American reinforcements rushed to the Ardennes in late December, were artillery units equipped with a weapon so new that most of the soldiers firing it did not fully understand how it worked. It was a standard 105 mm or 155 mm howitzer, the backbone of American field artillery, but the shells it fired were anything but standard. Each one was fitted with a small radio transmitter in the nose, a proximity fuse, officially designated the VT, variable time fuse, though the soldiers called it the posit fuse, or simply that magic shell. The technology was extraordinary. As the shell arced through the sky, the fuse transmitted a continuous radio signal. When that signal bounced back from the ground, or from any large object, the fuse measured the time delay and calculated the distance. At a preset altitude, usually between 20 and 50 feet, the fuse triggered the detonation. The result was an airburst, an explosion that sprayed shrapnel downward over a wide area, lethal to anyone caught in the open. Before the proximity fuse, artillery had been a weapon of approximation. Gunners fired shells with mechanical time fuses, trying to estimate how long it would take for the projectile to reach the target area, then setting the fuse to detonate at that moment. It was an inexact science, dependent on accurate range finding, weather conditions, and experience. Most shells detonated either too high, wasting their fragmentation effect, or too low, burying themselves in the ground before exploding. A good artillery battery might achieve airburst on 1 shell out of 10. With the proximity fuse, every shell was an airburst. The implications were staggering. Troops in the open, even troops dug into shallow trenches, were suddenly vulnerable to artillery in a way they had never been before. Armor columns could not simply button up and drive through a barrage. Supply convoys had no protection. The proximity fuse turned every artillery piece into an anti-personnel weapon of unprecedented lethality. And in December 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Germans were about to discover what that meant. The decision to deploy the proximity fuse in the Battle of the Bulge was not made lightly. The weapon had been one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Developed jointly by American and British scientists, it had been tested extensively, but used sparingly, primarily in anti-aircraft roles over the Pacific and against V-1 flying bombs over England. The fear was that if the Germans captured an intact fuse, they could reverse engineer the technology and deploy it themselves, potentially against Allied bomber formations or ground forces. But by late December, with German armies driving deep into Belgium and American units struggling to contain the advance, secrecy became a luxury the Allies could no longer afford. On December 22nd, authorization came down from Supreme Headquarters. Proximity fuse shells were approved for use against ground targets in the Ardennes. The artillery units were given a single directive: stop the German advance by any means necessary. They did. The first mass deployment of proximity fuses against German ground forces occurred on December 23rd, as clearing weather allowed Allied aircraft to begin flying close air support missions and artillery observers to pinpoint enemy columns with precision. German units that had advanced rapidly through fog and snow now found themselves exposed on open roads, their momentum broken by traffic jams, fuel shortages, and the sheer logistics of moving thousands of vehicles through a narrow salient. They were perfect targets. American forward observers, operating from hilltops and church steeples, radioed coordinates back to artillery batteries positioned miles behind the front lines. The guns rotated, elevated, and fired. Shells arced through the cold December sky, and over the German columns, they burst. The effect was immediate and devastating. A single proximity fuse shell could kill or wound every soldier within a 50-yard radius. A battery firing a coordinated barrage could clear an entire section of road in seconds. German soldiers who had survived years of fighting on the Eastern Front, who had endured Stalingrad and Kursk, found themselves helpless against an enemy they could not see and a weapon they did not understand. One German officer, captured near Bastogne, described the experience in his interrogation report. The shells exploded above us, not near us, not around us, above us. There was no warning, no time to take cover. The fragments came down like rain. We could do nothing but die. Another soldier, found wounded beside a destroyed Panther tank, was more direct. Your artillery has become terrible. It knows where we are. It knows when to explode. It is not like before. It is not war. It is murder. He was not entirely wrong. The Germans had faced overwhelming Allied firepower before. They had endured carpet bombing, naval gunfire, mass tank assaults. But those were weapons of brute force, imprecise, and often wasteful. The proximity fuse was different. It was intelligent. It was efficient. It killed with a mathematical certainty that left no room for chance or survival. And it was everywhere. By Christmas Day, every American artillery unit in the Ardennes had been issued proximity fuse shells. The German advance, which had penetrated over 60 miles into Allied territory, ground to a halt. Not because of heroic infantry stands or desperate tank battles, though there were many, but because the roads were choked with burning vehicles. And every time a German column tried to move, the air above them filled with explosions. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. German soldiers had been told they were fighting a soft, industrial enemy, an army that relied on machines because its men lacked the courage and discipline of the Wehrmacht. But now that industrial enemy had produced a weapon that turned the sky itself into a killing field. It was not courage. It was not discipline. It was technology wielded with cold, impersonal efficiency. The Germans began to fear the sound of incoming shells in a new way. Before, you heard the whistle, you dove for cover, you hoped the shell would miss or bury itself harmlessly in the dirt. Now, there was no hope. If the shell was coming toward you, it would detonate above you, and you would die or be maimed. There was no skill involved, no luck, no chance to outsmart the enemy. The machine decided, and the machine did not miss. The proximity fuse was not the only factor in the failure of the German offensive. The weather cleared, allowing Allied air superiority to reassert itself. American reinforcements, including the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne, held key road junctions and denied the Germans the routes they needed. Patton's Third Army executed a remarkable 90-degree turn and counterattacked from the south, relieving Bastogne on December 26th. Fuel shortages crippled German armor. Hitler's insistence on impossible objectives paralyzed decision-making. But it was the artillery, and specifically the proximity-fused artillery, that broke the momentum. It was the weapon that turned every road into a death trap, every advance into a gamble with annihilation. It was the weapon that convinced German soldiers, for perhaps the first time, that the Americans possessed not just material superiority, but technological superiority. A superiority so profound that it could not be overcome by bravery or tactical genius. There is a recurring image in the accounts of German survivors from the Ardennes: the airburst, the sudden flash overhead, the shockwave pressing down, the shrapnel hissing through the air like a swarm of invisible insects. It became a symbol, a shorthand for everything that had gone wrong with the offensive. The Germans had expected to fight Americans, flesh and blood soldiers who could be outmaneuvered, outfought, outsmarted. Instead, they fought a system, a network of observers, radios, calculations, and machines that turned artillery into a precision instrument. One soldier, interviewed decades after the war, remembered crouching in a frozen ditch on December 24th, watching shells burst above the road he had just been ordered to cross. He said he realized in that moment that the war was over. Not the battle, not the offensive, the war. Because if the Americans could do this, if they could make their shells explode exactly where and when they wanted, then there was no point in continuing. The gap in capability was too great. Germany had lost not because it lacked courage, but because it lacked the science, the industry, and the system that produced weapons like the proximity fuse. He was right. The proximity fuse was the product of a collaborative research effort that involved thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians across the United States and Great Britain. The core concept was developed at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, with contributions from the Carnegie Institution, the National Bureau of Standards, and dozens of private contractors. The miniature vacuum tubes that made the fuse possible were manufactured by Raytheon, Sylvania, and Westinghouse. The production lines ran 24 hours a day, turning out over 22 million proximity fuse shells by the end of the war. It was a triumph of mass production, but also of secrecy. Workers on the assembly lines did not know what they were building. Even many of the artillery crews firing the shells believed they were simply using a new type of time fuse. The technology remained classified until after the German surrender, when captured Wehrmacht officers were shown the fuses and asked if they had any idea such a device existed. Most said no. Some refused to believe it was real, insisting it must be a post-war fabrication designed to justify Allied victory. A few simply stared at the small metal cylinder, no larger than a man's fist, and shook their heads in silent acknowledgement that they had been beaten by something they had never imagined possible. After the war, German military analysts studied the Battle of the Bulge extensively, trying to understand where the offensive had gone wrong. Many pointed to fuel shortages, Hitler's meddling, the weather, the resilience of the American infantry, but a significant number identified Allied artillery, and the proximity fuse specifically, as a decisive factor. One post-war report concluded, "The American artillery achieved a level of effectiveness that rendered movement in daylight suicidal. The airburst fuse eliminated the protection of terrain and made concentration of forces impossible. Against such a weapon, our tactics were obsolete." It was a frank admission. German doctrine had emphasized maneuver, combined arms, and the offensive spirit. But all of that required the ability to move, to mass forces, to bring firepower to bear at the decisive point. The proximity fuse denied them that ability. It turned every road into an ambush, every open field into a cemetery, and it did so with a small radio transmitter and a vacuum tube, mass-produced in American factories and delivered to the front by the millions. There is a bitter irony in the fact that Germany, the nation that had pioneered so much military technology in the 20th century, the machine gun, the flamethrower, the blitzkrieg, found itself outmatched by an enemy it had dismissed as mechanically competent but intellectually inferior. The Germans had respected Soviet manpower and British determination, but they had never quite believed the Americans were capable of true innovation. They saw the United States as a nation of factories and farms, rich in resources but poor in military tradition. The proximity fuse proved them wrong. It was not just a weapon, it was a statement that American science, American industry, and American pragmatism could produce tools of war as sophisticated and deadly as anything the Wehrmacht possessed. More so because the Americans could produce them by the millions, deploy them across multiple theaters, and integrate them seamlessly into existing weapon systems. The Germans had built wonder weapons, the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet, the King Tiger tank, but each one was a masterpiece of engineering produced in limited quantities, often too late to matter. The Americans built practical weapons and made them in numbers that overwhelmed any defensive response. The proximity fuse was not exotic. It was simply effective, mass-produced, and impossible to counter. By early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German army had been pushed back to its starting positions, having lost over 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and countless vehicles. The Ardennes offensive, which had been intended to split the Allied armies and turn the tide of the war, had instead hastened Germany's collapse. The Wehrmacht never recovered. Among the wreckage left behind were thousands of shattered vehicles, burned-out tanks, and the frozen bodies of soldiers who had died in the open, caught beneath the airbursts that had turned the Ardennes roads into a graveyard. American graves registration units collected the dead and buried them in temporary cemeteries. German survivors were marched into captivity, many of them still stunned by what they had experienced. One American artillery captain, walking through the aftermath of a barrage near the town of Houffalize, came across a German sergeant sitting beside a destroyed half-track, his hands wrapped in bandages, his face blank. The captain asked if he needed medical attention. The German looked up and said, in halting English, "Your shells, they explode in the air. How do they know?" The captain did not answer. Security protocols forbade any discussion of the proximity fuse, even with prisoners. He simply gestured for medics to take the man away. But the question lingered. How do they know? The answer, of course, was that they did not know. They did not think. They simply measured, calculated, and executed. They were machines, doing what machines do, performing a task with inhuman precision. And in that precision lay a truth that the Germans had refused to accept until it was too late. The age of heroism, of individual courage and tactical brilliance, was giving way to the age of systems. The side that could see farther, calculate faster, and deliver firepower more efficiently would win, regardless of the bravery or skill of its soldiers. The proximity fuse was a harbinger of that future, a future in which wars would be won, not by the best soldiers, but by the best engineers. December 31st, 1944, midnight. Across the Ardennes, the guns fell silent. The German offensive was over. The roads, once choked with advancing columns, were empty save for the wreckage. Snow began to fall again, covering the scars of battle, muffling the echoes of explosions that had torn the sky. In a farmhouse converted to an artillery command post, an American fire direction officer updated his log. The entry for December was stark. 22,000 proximity fuse shells fired. Estimated enemy casualties, classified. Effectiveness, unprecedented. He closed the book and stepped outside. The night was clear, cold, and quiet. Somewhere to the east, beyond the shattered forests and frozen rivers, the German army was retreating. They would fight on for 4 more months, but they would never again launch an offensive. They had been broken not just by superior numbers or air power, but by a weapon that turned their own tactics against them, a weapon that punished concentration, mobility, and aggression with mechanical certainty. The officer did not know the full history of the proximity fuse. He did not know about the laboratories at Johns Hopkins, the factories at Raytheon, the scientists who had worked in secrecy to turn a theoretical concept into a mass-produced reality. He only knew that when his guns fired, the enemy died, and that was enough. The proximity fuse would go on to become standard equipment in every modern military. Its descendants guide anti-aircraft missiles, naval artillery, and mortar rounds. The basic principle, using radio waves or radar to detect proximity and trigger detonation, remains unchanged, though the electronics have become smaller, faster, and more reliable. But in December 1944, it was still new, still terrifying, still a revelation to soldiers on both sides. For the Americans, it was proof that their country's industrial and scientific base could produce not just more weapons, but better ones. For the Germans, it was a final, bitter lesson in the cost of underestimating an enemy. And for the young men who died on the Ardennes roads, caught beneath the airbursts that they never saw coming and could not escape, it was simply the end. Swift, impersonal, and absolute. War had always been cruel, but the proximity fuse made it efficient. And efficiency, in the end, proved more deadly than courage, more decisive than strategy, more final than any amount of fighting spirit. The Germans had come to the Ardennes expecting to fight soldiers. Instead, they encountered mathematics. And mathematics, unlike soldiers, cannot be outfought, outmaneuvered, or intimidated. It simply calculates and kills. The airbursts over the Ardennes roads were not just explosions. They were a message, written in shrapnel and fire, delivered with the cold precision of a machine that knew exactly when and where to detonate. The message was simple. The future of war had arrived, and it burst overhead. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.